Hello? Bet you didn't expect to see me again. Yeah, no, I know it's been a minute. It's been a couple months now. Yeah, a couple months, I think. But yeah, hope you guys are doing great. Um, yeah, I'm not gonna say I'm back. You should already know I'm pretty inconsistent with YouTube and stuff like that, and that's fine. One of the big reasons why I haven't been posting a lot is because the software that I usually use to edit my videos and stuff like that, they put up a paywall. So in order for me to, edit these long form videos and make them shorter, as well as add my little sound effects and widgets and text on the screen and stuff like that, now I gotta start paying money. And I don't want to do it. I don't want to do it. So yeah, we just gonna stick with the raw and uncut long form videos now for until they take that down, or until I find another free editing software. But yeah, hope you guys are doing well. For those of you who are new to my channel, I welcome you. For those of you who are not new, welcome back. And I welcome you back with open arms. Hope you are doing well. But yeah, anyway though. So, I wanted to talk about something that it's kind of been I would say from what I've been seeing recently on Christian YouTube, as far as because I don't live my life on Christian YouTube and stuff like that. But from the remnants of, being late to the party, I guess. But from the remnants of what I've been able to gather, there seems to be this conversation that, if I'm being honest, I think this is a conversation that has long been avoided and needs to be had, right? I think there's this conversation that needs to be had, and you can say it's this conversation of primary versus secondary, and not necessarily what are primary and secondary issues, but are the secondary issues, are they really important? And I don't say that in the way of are they really important? On some are they really that important? No, they're not. No. I'm saying that in the are they really that important, in the sense no, these things are important and we do need to talk about them, And that comes from this. Now, I'm not going to talk about the whole Jay Dyer versus all of the online evangelical drama. All right, if you came here to this channel thinking that I was going to talk about that, no. All right, you should know I'm not a drama channel. I'm not somebody that feeds into all that stuff. No, I'm not one of those channels. All right, if you thought this was one of those channels, sorry to disappoint. I'm gonna have to go somewhere else. But all right, but that, I will say, they are a part of this conversation, in the sense that those big platforms, we're starting to see that conversation starting to be had, and I'm glad that they are starting to have that conversation, right? But yeah, it's really this conversation of primary versus secondary issues, and if they're really important, and coming from an Orthodox perspective, right? If you don't know, if you don't know and you haven't read my bio, I am ethnically Nigerian. I'm American, but ethnically I'm Nigerian. And I'm a part of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, right? So I'm an Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Christian, right? AKA, I'm a Miaphysite, all right? I am a non-Chalcedonian, as the charitable online Eastern Orthodox Catholics and even Protestants and evangelicals will put it, right? But anyway, right? This conversation of primaries and secondaries, and if they're really important, I think this conversation definitely needs to be had. And for those who do know me and have known me for a while, you will know that I'm not an ecumenist, right? Now, just because I'm not an ecumenist does not mean that I'm somebody who goes on a tirade and starts to trying to behead everybody who doesn't believe what I believe. Nor does it mean that I'm somebody who's very mean and nasty to everybody else who doesn't believe what I believe, right? Just means like, yeah, I have a stance, all right? All right. I'm not, and I'm very, very planted and firm on my stance, all right? But that doesn't mean, I view everybody else as like the scum of the earth or like, they're the worst person on the planet just because they don't share my belief. Um, but this conversation is very, very important. Why is it important? Well, because, and oftentimes I do hear like, this phrase a lot of like, oh, we should focus more on the primary issues. Those other things are secondary. I usually mostly hear that from evangelicals and Protestants. Now, I do hear it sometimes from Roman Catholics and from some Eastern Orthodox as well, and even some Oriental Orthodox. So you do have these people in all circles, right? But majority of the time, you do hear it from evangelicals. And recently, actually, right, to comment, there was a talk recently, a interview that was released recently from this big YouTuber. His name's Ruslan KD. He interviewed a deacon from my mother church, Diakomaret, and there was a part one on the conversation where it was mostly interview, talking about the Ethiopian church, what the Ethiopian church believes. Of course, the Ark of the Covenant came up. I shared Diakomaret's sentiments on the Ark. If you watch my Allow Me to Reintroduce Myself video, I do talk a little bit about the Ark, not in depth, but in terms of like where I stand with it. You would be able to see that, like, if you rewatch it, you would definitely be able to see, like, okay, he kind of shares the Alchemaret's sentiments about the Ark. All right, so little tidbit there. But part one was like, on like the Ethiopian church, what the church is, what do we believe, and things like that. What's this whole Ark business? Okay, did Bob Marley really convert and things like that? And then the second half of that interview was a debate forum, right? Which I will say, and I'm not just saying this as somebody who's a part of the Ethiopian church. I'm saying this like I think even a third grader would be able to see this. I think Diakomaret held it down and did very well. All right. I think if that was a formal debate, Ruslan got schooled. I'm gonna just say it loud and proud. All right. Like I said, I'm not saying that just because I'm Ethiopian Orthodox. I think anybody who watches that and is not biased would definitely be able to see, yeah, no, Diakomaret, he did very well. Anyway, in that debate or in that conversation, there was a point where Ruslan, I think, when his back got kind of pinned up against the wall on, like, Diakomaret showing the importance of sacraments and things like that. Like, for example, like they were talking about confession. I think there came a point where when Ruslan's back was up against the wall, he resorted to, like, that phrase that I oftentimes hear of, like, I don't think the average, believer is, thinking about these things. So, in turn, what he's basically saying is, like, like, I don't think the average believer is thinking about these things, so therefore, why do they matter? Or why are they being, lifted up to such a degree as if, like, they're crucial? Like, I'm pretty sure there are people that went to heaven that, that didn't have these things in the forefront of their mind and things like that. And it kind of reveals the evangelical and Protestant way of thinking on these things. And it's because they view theology and the sacramental life of a Christian in the way of, like, because they've been divorced from these things, they only can think of these things in the cognitive way. They don't view these things as a lived experience. You know what I'm saying? Like, they don't view these things as, like, for example, as an Orthodox Christian, right? I don't view theology as well as, like, the sacramental life that I'm called to live. I don't view these things as, like, head knowledge or, like, allow me to quote Jordan Peterson. I don't view these things as, like, a checklist of theories where I'm just checking boxes, and things like that and making sure that I got everything right and stuff like that. You know what I'm saying? I don't view it as that, no. As an Orthodox, these are a lived experience. These are a lived reality, right? Theology, true theology, is that which is lived out. If you go to every Oriental Orthodox church, we live out, right? The whole reason why we schismed from the other churches is on a Christological issue. I guarantee you, if you go to any of these churches that are a part of my communion, the Oriental Orthodox communion, you will see that the Miaphysite Christology is lived out within our lives. You will see it being lived out throughout the liturgy. You will see it lived out throughout the community, right? You will see like all of our beliefs being lived out, right? I'm pretty sure you probably be able to say the same for the other churches, right? But if we're talking about Oriental Orthodox, you will definitely see that, the very things that we hold dear are being lived out in our communities, right? So something like confession, something like the sacraments, right? To try and put everything on a measuring stick, right? And we would say, as Oriental Orthodox, we would definitely say that's, that's the Achilles heel of the West, and something that is, in a Western mindset and stuff like that. But we don't view, like these things as like a checklist and, in the excuse me, like something like in a Gnostic way. Like we're not thinking of these things in a Gnostic way. No, we think of these things as a lived reality. We view these things as a lived reality. Something that has to be lived out, something that has to be done. But this whole talk of like oh, I think that's that's we got to work on the primary things. We shouldn't worry about the secondary things. Well, yeah, as an evangelical, right, that's your paradigm. And the reason why I don't give a footstool to this is because you, as an evangelical, right, that's your paradigm. I don't share your paradigm. What you consider secondary is not secondary to me, right? For example, the Christological issue may not be something that's big for you because that's your paradigm as an evangelical. But as somebody who's a part of a church and submits to a church, submits to its clergy, submits to its traditions, to its canons, to its saints, to the whole nine, right? Its interpretation of scripture, the whole nine, right? That's being led, like my whole institution, that's being led by the Holy Spirit. As somebody who submits to that, I cannot agree with this whole like, what I'm saying? Like, oh, like, that's just secondary. I can't agree with that. I can't. You know what I'm saying? Like, at my baptism, I can say this proudly and I can say this confidently. At my baptism, I had to state the Nicene Creed. And not only did I have to recite it, I had to affirm it. I had to affirm that I believed the Nicene Creed, not just as it's being read and as it's being said, but as the church taught. As my church taught, right? And as the church taught, as the historic church taught, if the Oriental Orthodox Church is the true historical church, right? The one true church. I had to affirm that very belief, right? And not only that, I had to affirm what we recite and what we affirm throughout the liturgy. For example, the Miaphysite Christology, right? You go to any of our churches, including the Ethiopian Church and the Coptic Church, we say the same thing throughout the liturgy, right? I believe even the Armenians too, right? But when we're talking about the human nature and the divine nature of Christ, right? There's a part where in our Kedase, before we take Korban, right? Korban is the Eucharist. We say that we believe that his humanity or his divinity parted not from his humanity, or his humanity parted not from his divinity. We believe that they departed not from each other, not even at the twinkling of an eye, right? Signifying and affirming that we believe that they were perfectly united, right? The human nature and the divine nature, right? The human will and the divine will. We believe these things never parted from each other, not even for a second, not even at the twinkling of an eye, right? We don't believe they ever parted from each other, right? As somebody that recites that every liturgy, every Kedase, every Kedase, as somebody who affirms this, for an evangelical to come up to me and say, oh, that's just secondary. No, that's not that's secondary to you. That's not secondary to me. To say that this is secondary, to affirm that that's secondary, would be to spit in the face of my saints, would be to spit in the face of my church fathers, would be to spit in the face of my very church. No, it's not secondary. All right, it's secondary to you. It's not secondary to me. Right? And I think, we're starting to see the results of this conversation being we're starting to see the results of this conversation kind of being avoided for the sake of for the sake of keeping the peace in a way, right? And me, I do think this conversation is necessary to be had, you know. I do think this conversation is very necessary, you know. But oftentimes when evangelicals bring up that objection or that line of reasoning, it does get under my skin, especially as an Orthodox Christian, because it's like, well, yeah, like you may not care about it, right? But for my church, it's a big deal, right? You personally, and especially because, you know, evangelicalism as well as Protestantism is very individualistic. I expect that sort of attitude from you. I expect you not to care about theology as much. Why? Because, well, when it comes to theology, let's be honest, when it comes to your very tradition, theology, sacramentology, soteriology, it all just becomes head knowledge, right? It all becomes head knowledge and nominal. It doesn't actually become a reality except for the part where you hear, well done, good and faithful servant. If we're just being honest, man. Like, let's just be honest, you know? And so, you know, when I hear that line of reasoning, you know, a lot, it does tend to get under my skin a lot. You know, it does tend to get under my skin of, yeah, you know, we should focus on the primaries. We shouldn't focus on these secondary issues. Based on who, or based on what authority are you saying that these are secondary issues? What about my Christology makes it a secondary issue? Because it was such an issue for my church that my church schismed from the other church at the time. You know what I'm saying? It was such an issue that a schism happened. Like I said earlier in this video, I wish it was a bad dream that I could wake up from. But the reality is that my church schismed from the other churches, right? I wish it was easy for us to reconcile. You know what I'm saying? I wish it was that easy to reconcile. I wish it was just politics. But as it stands, as the historical records stand, as my church stands, it's not. You know what I'm saying? You even have bishops from the Coptic Church, right? Bishop Raphael, who I respect very much for actually being a clergyman, right? There's actually video of him saying it, right? He literally says, like, those who say that the issue of the Chalcedon versus, you know, the Chalcedonians versus non-Chalcedonians, those who say it was just an issue of language are only looking on the surface. They're not looking beneath these things, right? So which goes to show, like, yeah, no, like, there is something deeper here than just language, you know? So for an evangelical to say, oh, you know, let's not worry about the secondary issues, you know, these small issues. It's not small, man. Maybe small to you because the very way that we live Christianity is different. I'd even go as far as to say we have different Jesuses, you know? So the way that you see the faith and the way that I see the faith, I think that just goes to show we have two different faiths, you know? So, you know what I'm saying? Anyway, I just wanted to touch on that. Yeah, and I also just wanted to make a video too. So this is kind of a win-win. I get to talk and get my thoughts out, but I also get to make a video as well. So, yeah. Like I said, though, you know, just because I have a stance doesn't mean I view other folks like the scum of the earth or as the worst people in the world and stuff like that. But yeah, that's all for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Comment your thoughts, like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. And yeah, I will see you all in the next video. باسم الآب وابن ومنفس قدوس هذا مراكمه أحد قدوس هذا ولد قدوس هذا ويتو منفس قدوس Amen. Yanesim salam. I mean, what the heck did I just say, bro? Yamasihu salam. Salam. Yanesim Gebre Selassie. I'm Gebre Selassie, and I will see you all in the next video.